Welcome back everyone to another video on the Solgaleo YouTube channel. Today we are running through our training report for Solgaleo Ninetales. We've played it multiple times, we've seen it lose to almost everything in the format. So now let's have a chat about it. Today I'm here with Blake and Jordan. Welcome Blake and Jordan.
Hey, how's it going?
Thank you.
And we're gonna have a bit of a chat about these decks and about this deck and how it fares up in the metagame at the moment. So when we start, we're just going to have a quick look at some pros and cons of the deck. Some really good things about it. And Blake, I think this is the reason that we were drawn to it, was it does a lot of damage and it has a lot of HP without weakness.
Yeah, and you know, combining those together with the lower Ninetales, just like so we could actually make the best use out of this deck was just like it just seemed obvious to try it out and see how it went.
For sure, and one of the good things about it, you didn't really see it on the videos that we did once or twice, but once it gets set up, it's really, really hard to stop because of those two criteria. So you've got lots of damage coming out, and it's hard to get the one-shot. It's also got really, really good GX attacks. So like in every single matchup that you face, you can use one of 3 GX attacks, which is really good because it gives you lots of versatility. But sometimes it can create situations where you really want to use 2. Like yesterday, like when we were doing Giratina Malamar, there was that time you wanted to Soul Burst, but you also wanted to do all of your healing.
I wanted to leave the option to use Prominence GX because it's such a good GX attack against spread decks.
Yeah, for sure.
But I was left in a position where I had to use Soul Burst because I just hadn't drawn the cards to like enable going without using it.
Yeah, 100%. And because of all of these things, sometimes you can just set up and just have an impregnable board state. You can just have everything set up and no way for your opponent to do anything, and from there you can just clean up, because...
it presents those, like, it can present those board states, like Buzzwell used to do in its prime, where you just, like, B-string 2 or 3 different times, and then, you like, no matter what your opponent did, even if they knocked out this threat or that threat, you would always be retaliated against, and there was no way you could prevent them from winning the game the next turn, which is what a lot of the time the deck can do.
I feel like in general this deck has such good matchups across the board because in theory any deck that can't do 250 damage should lose to this. I mean, with Max Potions and the GX attack from the new Solgaleo, pretty much anything besides Blacephalon will eventually just end up getting out-healed by this deck.
Yeah.
You're 100% right. But with some of the really, really big pros that we have, there are unfortunately a couple of really big cons that are kind of putting it, in my mind at least, to the bottom of the pile. For me, I feel like this deck has just lots of moving pieces. There's almost too many, because you need Ninetales, and you need 2 different Solgaleos, and you need Tapu Lele to set them all up. And then we say later on you need Delmires to get that damage. Sometimes you need to do 130. And like there's just lots of bits happening, which means that even with Ninetales sometimes it can feel really inconsistent. Which for a deck that's trying to reduce the inconsistencies, for it to still feel inconsistent is a big negative.
I think that's definitely a good observation, and like, but the thing with this deck is that a lot of times it can pull itself like forcefully into these dream scenarios where if it goes unhindered, it sets up everything on turn 2, and then it can Soul Burst, and then literally everything it needs for the whole game is on board. But all it takes is something like a Judge or a Marshadow to shuffle away your beacon targets on turn 2, which literally enable the rest of your game. And then your next draw supporter doesn't get what you want, and then everything falls apart.
Yeah, for sure.
And that's what I think happens.
The thing I was having the most problem with was I was finding it fairly consistent in setting up fairly early. Like I could get 2 to 3 Solgaleo set up pretty consistently by turn 2 or 3, but I was finding troubles with firstly chaining draw supporters and chaining the correct energy attachments, where I found I had everything I needed, but I just find that 1 or 2 cards that I needed for the turn to increase the board state was missing.
Yeah, for sure. And we were talking before about how we've got some really, really good GX options, one of the other big cons with this deck is that it doesn't have any really outstanding non-GX options. So you're always going in with those 2 prize attackers. And then I put up on the board there, one of the big cons is in our game it didn't beat Blacephalon. And Blacephalon is one of, if not the biggest type deck going into Brazil Internats, which is coming up, and in Australia coming up to Brisbane Regionals. Lots of people are talking about Blacephalon now. Maybe it was just because whoever played Solgaleo Ninetales, and it was probably me, is a bad player and just lost to Blacephalon. But I feel like you really want to have a solid matchup against that going into the next format.
That's true, and also I might say there was a mistake in the video where I beat you with Blacephalon that probably led to you losing the second game, where you probably wouldn't have because of it. I'd actually say that matchup is a lot closer than it seems. The first, upon playing more sets, I think you'd find the matchup is way more even than that. But I think Blacephalon's about the only deck that can swing the advantage that Solgaleo has by having a bunch of HP and no weakness.
Yeah, for sure.
About the only deck that does it currently, right now, and consistently.
100%. I agree. And when Blacephalon can just burn away 4 energy with a beast and a choice band to do 250, because sometimes you don't get into the Lysanellas when you need it. It's a bit it's a bit iffy. Like, it's still definitely worth continuing the testing for that matchup, but I think with all of the other cons going on, it's a bit tough, especially when Blacephalon is so fast. We've got those 3 cards down the bottom because those are probably the 3 biggest decks we're going to see moving forward. And with this deck, you've kind of got like a weird matchup against all of them, really. Like Blacephalon, like we were saying, it's a little bit tough. It can kind of go both ways sometimes. Zoroark is a bit annoying as well. I mean, you can still take the knockouts, but if you aren't careful with your board state, you can go over with abilities for Weavile, or you can go over with bench space for Lycanroc, and suddenly 250 HP doesn't matter anymore.
And Zoroark variants are also the decks that can afford to run the most copies of Judge in recent history as well.
Yeah, and like we were saying, it just because you need so much, that can be a big problem. I feel like the only really solid matchup that it has of the 3 that I'd go in saying it probably beats it most times is Malamar, only because you can do 130 relatively easily, and you've got a little bit more time against it, because Malamar's either spreading or half hitting most of the time, so you've got a bit more time to get going, whereas the other 2 are just too fast.
You've even got resistance on top of that as well.
Exactly.
So it really comes down to can you outpace Shrine and the pressure from Coco and cards like that. Like you said before, the real danger card for this deck is probably Weavile. Weavile's really good at the moment, and I think more and more decks are going to run it in their lists because it's so efficient. And a lot of decks can afford to use like the Fighting Dark Fairy unit energy, so that they can fit in cards like Weavile, and
for sure.
If they're not already doing it, to allow Alola Ninetales or something else to attack, especially in like Buzzrock and stuff like that.
Another problem I found is whenever one Solgaleo goes down early, the rest of the deck really crumbles quickly, because you really do need both Solgaleos to be in play pretty much the whole game. And even if a deck like Lycanroc, for example, can only get 1 knockout and then it has to 2-hit for the rest of the game, that 1 knockout can set you back really, really far.
Yeah, for sure. Let's move on. Blake, we've got your Fire Slide up on the board. This is your deck. You think it's the new hotness, but you've got a couple of things that you'd like to say. So let's work through it.
Alright, so originally in my list I ran 3 copies of Sightseer and 3 copies of Cynthia. That's originally the split I found the most comfortable. I thought it made the most sense, but I hadn't tested out Sightseer that much. Upon playing it more, I feel that dropping down Sightseer to 2 count and upping Cynthia to 4 made more sense, because whilst putting like energies in the discard for Turbo Strike to work, to enable Turbo Strike better, is good. In theory it's good, but in practice you don't often get enough of the energies in hands to be able to get them with Sightseer into the discard pile.
Yeah, fair enough. Well,
so Sightseer is just an additional consistency card rather than that.
Yeah, for sure. It's one of the things that I'm going to talk about as well. I feel like Sightseer is a bit of a weaker option, and to cut a Cynthia for it is probably not optimal.
I've definitely been finding Sightseer to be quite overhyped, not just in this deck, but in general. I've been finding it to be a lot more awkward than I thought it would be originally.
I think the only true deck where Sightseer shines is Blacephalon, and in that deck it's amazing. And you can run it in a count higher than 2 and have it be good, because all you want to hold
energy,
is
right?
you're playing 16 energy, and often all you want to do is hold onto the beast string, but you want to get rid of everything else, and that's like the perfect supporter for it. So like Sightseer has its home there.
Yeah.
But the next part is, and this is probably one of the biggest discussion topics for the deck, is it worth it to run Custom Catcher? I'm really torn on this, because the card on its own is fine, like just to draw cards when you're in a bind.
Just to do that.
And you don't have a draw supporter.
Oh, draw 3 up to 3. Sorry. Yeah.
Draw up to 3. Yep. And it can create some really, really massive powerhouse turns if you can pull off like a double Ninetales, like we're talking about, like Dream States, where you get more than you need, and it's just one of those cards that allows you to really hammer in your advantage, and make it almost unwinnable for an opponent in early stages, like getting out a turn 2 Solgaleo and then using double Custom Catcher to kill a Malamar on like your first turn evolved is devastating. And then being able to play a Cynthia or something after that.
Yeah, for sure. That's
ridiculous.
That's really, really solid. But again, it relies on having all of those pieces all at the right time.
Yeah,
you know?
Both of the Vulpix have to survive, and then you have to evolve both of them, and still have and obviously you still have to have both the Solgaleos in order to pull it off. So it's not something that happens very often. But when you do get off the double Custom Catcher with Ninetales, it's very satisfying, and it feels like it's worth it. But when we talk about how many things this deck needs to keep going, is it worth running 3 Custom Catcher over more consistency cards?
Yeah, when you could be running things that are going to help you get set up.
More healing cards, more stadium cards, potentially, more options against its worst matchups. Custom Catcher doesn't really fix any matchups, it's just like a good card.
Yeah, so it's one of those cards that you're never unhappy to see, but doesn't necessarily help you in the long run.
So it's like, do you cut a good card and somehow make the deck better, or do you run the good card and have it come up in some clutch scenarios, or do you cut it for like better matchups? And that's one of the biggest discussion points for me.
Well, you've got a couple of decent cards up here on the board, like that maybe we could use instead of Custom Catcher.
Yeah, well, and obviously, like the most necessary add-on, which I didn't have in initially, which was Delmar's, which is obvious now. That has to go in. You got to cut space for it. The second Rescue Stretcher or the third Guzma. If you're not running Custom Catcher, the third Guzma is fine. But if you're running Custom Catcher at the moment, like I am, the third Guzma is just excess, especially with Ultra Road. To help you retreat, you don't really need Guzma to help you with that, so cutting one of those and putting in Delmars just fixes all of your math, and it also allows you to cut other cards like Choice Band, as we'll talk about later. But other possible techs for certain matchups, Wobbuffet is a huge card, especially against say Bozrok. They rely a lot on Diancie to pump their damage early, to put on early pressure, and to get to the to be able to push that 250 onto the Solgaleo. So if you can have Lysander Labs in play and a Wobbuffet down, suddenly you're shutting off 50 damage from Buzzrock, and they can't do 250 unless you've been silly enough to bench 5 Pokemon.
Yeah, which obviously in that matchup you wouldn't be.
But the only thing it doesn't stop is Beast Energy. And that's only a one-of, and they have to have it at the right time. So it's definitely, and it helps with a lot of other matchups as well, especially with like that new White Kyurem deck that runs 2 Prism Stars that like to attack and use their abilities, like Arceus Prism and Volcanion Prism. A lot of decks are using Ditto Prism, so just by having it down on the field, you can stop them from using their like Tech Zeb Striker or Salazzle or like in Blacephalon when they use it, or the stops them from having like a second Sneasel or Rockruff. So Wobbuffet is really impressive as a tech card, and it might be worth it if it hinders those matchups enough.
For sure.
And the other is probably Registeel. That's the non-Jax attacker I think has the most potential to do well in this deck for me. Originally I thought about the Dialga, but I never found myself using turn back time, the first attack. It didn't come up enough in a lot of matchups for me. And the 130 costs 4 energy, so I'd rather use Registeel, which does 120 and 130 with the addition of Dhelmise for those numbers instead, and it's a bit bulkier as well.
Yeah, especially with Exoskeleton, it tends to, it takes a little bit more to get rid of it. Like, I mean, you're not getting killed by a Zoroark or anything like that, are you?
Yeah, everything's sort of teched out to do the 120 to 130 mark, so they can hit then the non-GX attackers.
Yeah.
Not a lot of decks prefer to do 140 as their number, especially those like the raid decks were just putting like Dhelmises and Shining Lugias in, but they can't do 140 damage. So
yeah, for
Yeah,
sure.
I feel like the most important thing with Registeel is that getting energy onto a non-EX Pokemon is pretty easy to do because it only requires DCE, so you don't actually have to Turbo Strike to it to attack with it. You can just manually attach 2 turns, which no other non-EX Metal Pokemon can realistically do.
yeah, that's it. Well, yeah, the Dialga is the only other Pokemon that has like those sort of color attachments. I think it's either Registeel or the Dialga if you're going to choose one. But yeah, I mean, you can Soul Burst to it, or you can manually attach to it. One of the things is the deck really loves playing for double colorless energy, but in real truth, it doesn't have that many things that use double colorless energy. So having the Registeel is another good way to.
Yeah, it's a cool attachment. You can just whack it down, and you don't need to stress about it.
Sometimes you're just holding on to DCEs because you're waiting to max potion off the Turbo Strike Solgaleo and replace it with another one. And this gives you a place to actually attach that energy.
Yeah, for sure. Alright, well, we might move on to Jordan now. Jordan, your view of the deck. You didn't necessarily play in any of the videos, but you were testing along with us. Let's run through your thoughts on this list.
No problem. So the first inclusion I actually made was adding Mysterious Treasure as a 2 count. And my main reasoning for this, obviously, was to increase the consistency, but I don't like playing a high count of Elm in decks that don't run Zoroark because they're just such dead cards in the late game, not being able to trade them away. And realistically, Sightseer was the only easy way to get rid of it. So adding Treasure allowed me to cut down the Elm count while not sacrificing the consistency of opening Elm. But it also has the added bonus of searching out Cosmog and Dhelmise along with Cosmog, which are cards that you really need on very specific turns for them to have their full use. So Mysterious Treasure, being able to search those 2 cards is very important, I feel.
Yeah, giving yourself the extra out. You never know when you're going to need that Dhelmise to do 130. I reckon it's a pretty good inclusion, because that's one thing that I did find myself doing a lot, is sitting with a hand that has Elm in it, or just cards that are useless. Would have been really handy to have that kind of extra Pokemon search if you had it.
And of course, it also increases the number of cards which discard cards from your hand, making it easier to accelerate energy to the discard for Turbo Strike, which with a lower Sightseer count becomes more important with Mysterious Treasure.
For sure.
Yep.
The other card which I increased the count of is obviously Max Potion, because as we were mentioning earlier, most of this deck's good matchups come from the fact that it doesn't get one hit. I feel like that's the main draw of this deck is the fact that decks that can't knock it out will lose to it eventually because it's dealing damage, and they aren't. Very similar to the Acerol strategy that Zoroark uses, but even more so. So increasing that count to 3 instead of 2 really gives it a much better matchup against decks like, as mentioned, Zoroark and Lost March, and it makes your Malamar matchup even stronger than it already was.
Yeah, I found myself making this change as well later down the week when I finally figured out the cards that were in excess of for the list. So when I finally found the cuts for it, the 3rd Max Potion was the first thing for me that went in.
And it ended up being really useful, right, when we were playing that Malamar game, because since I was spreading so much damage around, you always found yourself in situations where you were either, if you missed the Max Potion, then you're in a bit of a tough spot. But hitting the max potion means that you're pretty much safe for the next turn.
Yeah, after like 2 flying flips, you'd put me in a state of check, and then I would have to find max potion. Otherwise, you could put me in a position where you just won the game very quickly. So the third max potion was really clutch in that matchup.
Hitting the max potions at the right time, I feel like, is the most important thing between winning or losing a game with this deck with many of its matchups. Even against decks like Blacephalon, where it's not as important, it still is probably one of the more important cards if you are eventually going to win that match, because eventually they're gonna have to 2-hit, otherwise you're gonna lose anyway, and that will be the card that ends up saving you if it pulls off.
Yeah, for sure. And now I've noticed on the other side of your screen there, Jordan, you've got a couple of cuttable cards there, and I'm seeing a big pink one. I'd really like you to explain that. I find that interesting.
Yeah, I feel like that's probably the most controversial change I made. And I made that change very late into my testing towards the end of the week. So basically, the main draw to attacking with Ninetales, I think, is for 2 matchups in particular, being Blacephalon and Lost March, where Blacephalon, or like any Ultra Beast deck realistically, specifically Blacephalon, because it gives you the 1-hit option. And that is probably the main reason I would want to keep Fairy Energy. But the problem I was finding is that the only realistic way to find the Fairy Energy early was to use Soul Burst, and the only reason you would want to attack with Ninetales is to use the GX attack. So having the Fairy Energy to be Soul Burst really didn't help with what you were trying to do with Ninetales. And the other matchup where the Fairy Energy is important is Lost March, and from my testing, I've found Ninetales was actually a really bad attacker against that matchup for 2 reasons. Firstly, that's the spread only worked if you were able to attack with Ninetales 2 or 3 times, which overall seemed unlikely because you'd either have to max potion or you'd get knocked out. And secondly, the fact that Lost March is quite easily able to knock out Ninetales compared to Solgaleo, and I feel like the reason that matchup is winnable if you're able to get into a board state where your opponent can't Lost March for knockout and you can just keep max potioning and attacking repeatedly. So cutting the Fairy Energy for an extra metal not only helped with the consistency of the Solgaleos, but it also gave me the extra slot to fit the max potion in.
Yeah, for sure. I can see that 100%. And that was one of the big problems that I was having against Blacephalon as well, is that there's so much that I want to do, and there's so many good GX attacks in this list, but you can only use one. So you got to pick, do you want to take a knockout easily, or do you want to set up your board? And if you want to set up your board, then you have to have all the pieces together, you know? So
yeah,
I can definitely see that. It's something that I would probably cut a little bit regrettably, because I really like the option, but I can completely understand where you're coming from with that choice.
Yeah, and the other cuttable card obviously being the choice bands. Blake talked about this a bit with the Delmise, but the Delmise being an obvious inclusion, especially with the Mysterious Treasures. And the 230 and the 130 and the 240 were the main 2 numbers the choice band was used to hit, so Delmise counteracts that anyway. However, there is one big number which you're not able to hit with Delmise, and that is obviously 250 for a potential Solgaleo mirror match. But I actually don't think this choice band helps much in the mirror, because Lysander Labs, the stadium of choice for this deck, is going to be in play almost the entire game for that reason, because neither player is playing a replacement stadium. So the one matchup where choice band is actually useful is the matchup where you're least likely to be able to use it. So if you were to tech throw a mirror match, I would actually rather see a Kukui of the choice bands, to be honest.
That's completely reasonable as well, because the only other time that you're trying to do 250 is against Decidueye, and Decidueye is not exactly an attacking powerhouse. You can afford to 2-hit that.
Well, Decidueye is 240.
Yeah, the Delmise does that.
Oh, jeez, well then forget about it. What am I even talking about?
Well, it's funny. Both of the cuttable cards. The other matchup that both of those cards were for was actually for Rayquaza, and Ninetales was the other additional help against Rayquaza, because with choice bands you could do 130 and then a 32 a bench one, and then one hit Array with a Alolan Ninetales, and set up the next one to be 1 hit without choice bands. But the funny thing is, Ray's completely disappeared off everyone's testing radar. So, like, the chance to, for Ninetales to shine as an attacker, with both of those cuttable cards in there, is sort of gone back to the wayside. So, if there's a surge in Rayquaza, perhaps those cards find their way back into the list.
Yeah, I could definitely see that, especially since those are 2 cards that when cut kind of increase the consistency of the matchups of the deck overall, whereas those are specifically cards used to tech for a certain metagame. So if you're expecting more Rayquaza and more Blacephalon is going to be tough even with these cards. But that's definitely the type of meta where you can justify adding those cards, I feel.
Yeah, 100%. Well, we might move on to my slide now, and you guys pretty much said everything that I wanted to say, so I've just thrown some random stuff up there. My thoughts were that the deck's really good in theory, but when you actually use it in practice, it doesn't do what it needs to do as often as I'd like. And so it got me to a point where I was like, do I play like 4/4 Sightseer Cynthia lines? Like, what do I do? Do I put Zeb Striker in this to try and increase my consistency? Like, what do I actually do? Now, I'm not saying that Zeb Striker is a good inclusion, because we've already been talking about the fact that there's so many moving pieces, we don't want to add another one. But I just got to that point where I was like, there's just so much that I need that I just want more.
You were desperately looking for an answer to the problem.
I'm just trying to find more cards, you know? So I think that's probably one of the massive issue that I've had. And another thing as well is that sometimes it's difficult to decide what you need to prioritize, because both Solgaleos are really, really good. And it's really, really hard to decide. If you can only get one, it's hard to decide which one to get. And I've particularly had this problem against Blacephalon, where I can put a Solgaleo promo in, and then Turbo Strike for not a knockout, and put 2 energy on something, and hope that it doesn't die. Or I can put in a Solgaleo Ultra Road, and Soul Burst and set my board up, but then that Solgaleo is dead next turn anyway. So
yeah, I feel like when I was playing the deck, I didn't have too much trouble deciding which one to use first. There was usually a fairly obvious answer to which one to use, but the problem for me was that usually the answer was you need both.
Yeah, exactly, and sometimes you find yourself where you only can get one.
One isn't, a lot of the cases, one isn't good enough.
Yeah. And
whereas that's the
one of the big
difference
problems
between it's the stark contrast between this deck and other Stage 2 decks, where one of these Stage 2s is good enough, like, say, Gardevoir. Getting out one Gardevoir, it's fine, it's great. It's like, getting out 2 would be much better, obviously, but you could manage with one. But in this deck, you sort of need both working in conjunction to get the sheer, all the power and all the potential out of the deck.
Yeah, for sure. And that's why I've put that last little dot point down there. I just think that this deck, even though you've got Ninetales and you've got all of these cards that can help you find stuff, I still think it asks for just a little bit too much. It's not so much that it's impossible to achieve, but I think that it's just not going to do it often enough for me to want to play it.
I find that last point hilarious, not because it's incorrect. I think it's correct, but I think it's hilarious because I don't think a Stage 2 deck has ever been in a position where it's asked for less, but it's still asking for too much.
Yeah, no, I know what you mean. Like, it's just, and it's 100% because you want both Solgaleo out. Like, if you have a turn where you only get one, then it's just not good enough. And every other you said it the best. Like, if you get one Stage 2 in any other deck, it's usually fine. But in this one, it feels bad when you don't.
You sort of feel you sort of feel empty until you have both at the same time.
Yeah, exactly. But when you get both, it's insane. The combo is nuts.
You feel invincible when you have both.
It's when you miss it, and you miss it more often than you would want to. I feel like it asks for too much. Now
it doesn't seem like you would, because you've got Beacon as your support Pokemon, which then evolves into the Pokemon that grabs the rare candies that you Beacon for, and it just seems like,
so good.
How does it go wrong?
It seems so good, but it so frequently falls apart. And I don't know whether that was just the games that I played, or whether it was just bad luck.
And to be fair, over the course of the week we played, 5 sets? We played 5 sets?
4 sets.
4 sets, sorry.
Well, four filmed sets.
4 film sets.
Yeah.
So, trying to drag a conclusion out of a deck from 4 sets is probably a bit rich. You probably need a bit more testing than that, but we got a taste of what the deck can pump out and what the deck is lacking from this week.
Yeah.
And I think most of these points are accurate based on the week's testing.
I put in the corner that Dialga. I think you had it in your first list Blake, the one we showed.
Yeah, that was in the original, but in both of the Japanese lists, which I took inspiration of the deck list from. And I thought, oh, that's cute. That'll come up sometime, and
Yeah.
it never came up.
It never comes up, right? Like I was testing it, and I was like, oh, this is gonna be so good against Zoroark. It's gonna be so good against Malamar, because you can just bop a Malamar with it, and it's dead.
Well, it doesn't matter if we can't one-shot Decidueye, even
Yeah.
with Delmon.
Because
I
we
can just evolve it down to a Rowlet and kill it, even if it's only for one prize.
And it
How
just,
effective is that?
it just never comes up. And even
Doesn't
if you
come up.
do manage to get the Dialga in play, you're still 2 attachments away from attacking with it. I feel like it's a good card, but it's not a good card in this deck.
I definitely like the idea of the Registeel more here.
Yeah.
I feel like Dialga is one of those cards that needs to be able to come into play and do what it has to do the turn it comes out. And this isn't the deck that allows you to do that, because you have to either double attach to it or Soul Burst, and then your opponent goes, oh crap, that is a problem.
Yeah, I better kill that, yeah.
I better kill that, or it's okay, I can win the game before this card is a problem.
Yeah, exactly. All I need to do is just kill Cosmogs, and it's not even an issue.
Yeah.
But hey, anyway, let's do a bit of wrap up now. Some final thoughts. There's 3 questions up on the board. What tier do we think it fits into? What meta is this deck going to shine in? And would you play it in a regional level tournament? These are probably the questions that you really need to have an understanding of if you are even considering playing this deck. So let's start off. Where at the moment, bearing in mind that we don't know what's super good because Brazil hasn't happened yet. But what tier do we think this deck fits into? Jordan, do you want to start off?
I think I would probably put it just outside of tier 1, not quite tier 2, but more of it like a tier 1.5 kind of area, because its matchups are quite good, and I think with some of the changes we can make, it can be more consistent with time. Once the list gets finalized, I think it's definitely got a strong place in the meta, but I don't see it getting up to tier 1 with cards like Zoroark or Blacephalon quite yet.
Yeah, that's fair enough. Blake?
I'd like to follow up with, I don't know if it was possible for Jordan to more accurately say exactly what I was going to say than what he just said before. That's what I was going to say. It's not consistent enough to be tier 1. If the deck was consistent, it'd be tier 1. Honestly, with its matchups it's got, I think it has a great Zoroark matchup, even though it lost its set on record. The one match where I actually set the deck up,
it crushed it.
It didn't feel like Mitch even stood a chance.
No.
There was nothing. There was no counterplay. There was nothing to it. It was trivial once the deck actually did what it wanted to. So I feel like if we can just get to the point where the deck does what it's supposed to, 2 out of 3 games. I think that seems like a good number. 2 out of 3 games. That's pretty important.
2 out of 3 seems fine.
Right now, I think we're sitting at, funnily enough, 1.5. So that's the tier I'd put it in.
Yeah, fair enough.
It doesn't sound like you're asking for too much, but it certainly seems like it.
I know, right?
Yeah.
I tend to agree. I think it's a 1.5. I'd probably say, if I'm gonna be pedantic about it, I reckon it's 1.75. I think it's slightly closer to tier 2 than tier 1. I don't think that it's a tier 2 deck. It's not like it's a joke deck that you pull out for fun.
I think that that grade makes sense for you because you've only had bad experiences with the deck.
That's all what I was just about to say.
Yeah.
I'm putting it there because I've only ever played matchups where I've lost with it or I've lost to it. So it's kind of rough. I can see it being really good. I don't think I can see it ever being tier 1 because it just doesn't, like we were saying, just doesn't have the consistency that those tier 1 decks kind of have. And
I think if there's one thing it lacks at the moment is versatility. I think it's too linear.
It just does the thing that it needs to do, and if it does that thing, it probably wins, but it doesn't do that thing enough.
And well, that's the other question is, does it matter if it's linear? Like,
well, Blacephalon's a linear deck,
Yeah, well, that's it. It's fine if a deck is linear. It's not like if a deck takes no skill that it means it's a bad deck. Because if all you have to do is declare Sunsteel Strike and go, I don't have energy on that card anymore. I better put energy on that card again. Yeah. With Turbo Strike.
Then it would be a problem.
Does that mean the gameplay or the strategy is bad?
No.
Probably not, because if you take a one shot and then go, this isn't good enough, I'll half hit and make sure I can one shot next
The
turn.
next time, yeah.
And you're on like a 5 or 6 turn clock. In theory, if you get it all going properly, it's probably still a pretty good deck.
Yeah, I see this as a high potential deck. Like, if the list gets better in the future, or if we learn like a better way to play it, I'm not even sure if we've been playing it as optimally as it could be played. But I feel like this is a deck with a lot. I feel like this is a deck that has a lot of potential for the future, and maybe one day could be tier 1. But right now, I think it needs some work.
Yeah, it's one of those decks where you keep all the cards in your binder because you never know when you might need it, but you probably don't pull it out straight away. It's not on your first couple of pages.
I would agree.
In what meta does this deck shine, Blank? When can you see this deck being at its best right now? Like, what needs to happen? What needs to happen in Brazil for us to go, yep, Solgaleo Ninetales is the play?
I think if Sceptile dominates, I think suddenly this deck shoots up in popularity, because I think Sceptile is another one of those decks that this obliterates, because its main calling is like, oh, it walls Blacephalon, which is probably its main appeal at the moment, and it has 230 HP, so the decks that aren't Blacephalon can't kill it, and it has healing as well. It sort of just seems like a more consistent version of this, but just doesn't do as much damage at the moment. So if suddenly like the Pretender comes out and performs well at Brazil, then you know the real deal, Solgaleo Ninetales,
maybe
goes,
suddenly he's in.
What do you think you're doing? Get off my chair, get off my throne.
Here we go.
Of tanking damage and doing one shots, and then it can probably dethrone the Sceptiles and the Zoroarks. I think it becomes that sort of triangle. Then
I see that as well. Like if Zoroark wins Brazil and Sceptile has a solid showing, then suddenly Solgaleo Ninetales is in consideration because it has really good matchups against those two. And the thing, like, I can see it being played in Zoroark heavy metas, but would you play this over Buzzwole? Like, probably not. You probably play Buzzwole Ninetales if Zoroark's big. But, I don't know.
I would extend from saying that it's got a good Sceptile matchup. I actually think it's a good pick for a format which is dominated by Stage 2s in general. Because thinking about other Stage 2 decks, firstly, Ninetales is used in just about all of them to set up their engine better, and Solgaleo, especially with the custom catch, custom catcher, it really doesn't get punished for being slow against those decks because it can very quickly come back up. And other Stage 2 decks on top of this give it more time. So
I just remember in one of our testing matches, it might not have even been this week, but one of our earlier matches where I played Solgaleo Ninetales against Mitch's Buzzrock Ninetales. As soon as he evolved into Ninetales, I custom captured it and turbo striked and accelerated energy onto my Solgaleo GX at the same time because his had weakness and mine didn't. And
that's pretty much like the most efficient play this deck could possibly make. And Stage 2 decks are almost always going to be using.
Well, yeah, and actually, now that you've said that, Blake, if Zoroark is big after Brazil, then this is in a really good spot because people are going to play Buzzwole, and I just remembered how badly I got beaten by you playing against this. So, like, that's another decent matchup. Like, it's not a good matchup because Buzzwole can still blow stuff up, but...
No, I mean, you won the second set, so it's not an easy match, but it certainly, like, has its big plays and stuff like that.
It's not bad at all.
It has a lot of power plays.
Yeah, for sure. Alright, one last question before we wrap it up, and this is going to be a pretty quick one. Jordan, would you play this deck in a regional level tournament? Would you take this to Brisbane?
I think as long as we can improve the list to be consistent enough, and the meta is decks like Zoroark, Malamar, and other Stage 2 variants, I could easily see myself playing this deck. It's just, as long as Blacephalon is as hyped as it is right now, or the deck is setting up the way it has been recently, I think at this moment I probably wouldn't consider it.
Fair enough. Blake, what about you, mate? Are you going to take this one to Brisbane?
I am torn, because as much as I would love to just go, I'm not bringing this, I'm going to bring Blacephalon. But right now, Blacephalon's the most hyped deck, and I still haven't found an effective way to deal with Sceptile. As far as, there's so many techs you can put in, but all of them can be countered by good play, and So if I wasn't going to play this, I'd play Blacephalon at the drop of a hat, but like the drop of a beat. But honestly, yeah, I tend to agree with Jordan. If we could get this list even a bit more consistent, I would consider it, because I don't think there's a deck that sort of straight up goes, oh cool, that's Solgaleo Ninetales, that's an auto win.
I agree with that. But I'm gonna be nice and quick here. No, I'm not taking this to Brisbane. I don't see this being the right play. I could be convinced that it's the right play, but as I'm sitting here right now talking about it, I don't think that it's going to be good enough to win at a regional. I'd take this to League. I'd take this to a challenge. I might even take it to a cup if I'm like pretty close to being capped on points. But I'm not taking this to a regional. I don't see it as being consistent enough to get there. But that's just me. And I've only ever lost with or lost to the deck. So like, you know,
Yeah.
it's not. I've only had negative experience.
Understandably a skeptic.
Yeah, I'm firmly in tier 1.75 camp.
Yep.
But hey, anyway, so that's it. That's it for Solgaleo Ninetales for the week. Hopefully you've enjoyed the week. I haven't. I'm not gonna lie. So it's been a real drag.
I was hoping to enjoy the week a lot more, but
Yeah,
so far,
But
I was
maybe
like,
not.
this is my baby. It's going to steamroll, and everyone's going to be like, "Wow, Blake, you were so right. That was such a good choice to pair these two together, and it's so good.
Yep,
Your list is amazing."
Nope. Didn't work out that way. But
It
that's
did
okay.
not.
So
Like Garchomp all over again.
it's just like Garchomp. So yeah, I'm looking forward to moving on from it. And tell you what, Jordan, what we might do tomorrow, maybe we just play some fun games. What do you reckon about that for Sunday?
Sounds good to me.
Just play some fun games to muck around for a bit, and then we'll come
I
back
got
on
some good decks built.
some good decks. Sounds good. We'll tell you what, we'll keep them a secret for tomorrow. But we might come back on Monday and tell you what do you think is going to be the most hyped deck for Brazil?
There's no question about this one. It's
Yep.
Blacephalon.
It's Blacephalon. So I reckon on Monday we might have a look at Blacephalon. We'll see if we can get that tech to work next week for our testing table.
I think the main question of this next week for us is to find the perfect answer to Sceptile.
I think
that's the one.
that's gonna be the big thing, and I reckon Sceptile is gonna be game 4. We're gonna play that game 4.
It's the final boss for
That's
sure.
the final boss. So we'll see how we go with it. Anyway, thanks Blake for coming along.
No worries.
Thank you Jordan for your insights.
No problem.
And we will see you all next time for more Pokemon TCG content on the Sable Eyes. Thank you very much, and goodbye.